And a good morning. Welcome to Meet the Day. My name is Steve Thompson, producer here at KUYO, Classic Christian Radio, AM 830. And on the phone with me this morning, I have Anthony Harper, who is a journalist and a White House correspondent. And he focused specifically on Israel and human rights issues. And so we're happy to have him in, not in studio, but on the phone with us today. And I want to thank him for joining us. Thanks for being here.
Hey, it's great to join you, Steve.
Mm-hmm. Now, as a White House correspondent, you get to ask a lot of really fun questions. But before we get into those, I just want to point out you are the editor as well of the Intermountain Christian newspaper. For maybe listeners who aren't familiar with that, tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, this started about 20 years ago. So this year, later in the year, is our 20-year anniversary. So this was started to fill a void. There wasn't a Christian newspaper in our area, and answer to prayer for one of the Christian Newspaper Association key persons. He was the director of Christian Newspaper Association, John Fortmeyer, and with his newspaper called Christian News Northwest out of Portland, Oregon area. And so this is specifically an answer to prayer on several fronts regarding the need to have a newspaper that would be a voice of truth. And so that's what this is, a voice of truth. And there are a lot of issues to talk about surrounding the matters of truth in journalism.
Mm-hmm. Now, if people want more information about Intermountain Christian News, where can they go to find more information and maybe subscribe to your guys' news feed?
Our website, imcnews.org. People can do a search for Intermountain Christian News, and we'll find that through the search engines. But we have a donate button on our website, links to subscription information, and people can get our newspaper, our printed newspaper, in the mail.
Okay.
And so all that information is there on the website. Awesome.
Well, let's go ahead and get into kind of more your current focus these days. I know for several years now you've been a White House correspondent, and you're in the thick of it there in terms of journalism, trying to ask hard questions and things like that. And sometimes they, in almost a miraculous way, sometimes you get called on. You get to ask some, tough questions. And just one of the things I know I'm dying to know, because I'm a news person. I'm kind of a media news junkie. What is it like dealing with and or asking questions of Jen Psaki?
Okay. Oh, very tense. A very tense-filled moment trying to get her attention. There's a lot of competition of people in the press room vying to get her to call upon them. So it really takes a lot of tenacity. And I give the credit to God for having these major breakthroughs for her to recognize me and at least take my questions. I didn't expect good answers from her, but I wanted the important questions to be heard by people.
Mm-hmm. And that's important because, like you said, you're not expecting a good answer in response, but it does make other journalists in the room kind of stop and think about, wait, what's he talking about? Why is he asking that question that way? It makes other journalists think, and journalists by nature should be somewhat curious, and so maybe they then look into things, and so things kind of spread organically that way. You mentioned kind of in our pre-interview that during the beginning of the Biden administration, this first year, basically, you never got called upon at all.
True. I never got called upon by Press Secretary Jennifer Psaki until just recently. April 7th was the first time being called on by her, but I was called on by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. I was allowed to ask a question. It was because he was fielding the questions, not her. So that was taken back in August of last year when that was during the Afghanistan crisis. So I had some challenging questions then. But from August until like basically end of March, a real empty spot as far as being called on.
But you've still been there. You've been prepared to ask questions, but they just really haven't happened. And so that's kind of what makes it amazing, because you've actually asked between her and one of the undersecretaries, I think, 3 questions just recently.
Correct. Yeah, so the major breakthrough, an answer to prayer, and what would like to comment, at least Press Secretary Jennifer Psaki acknowledged me in a press room back in September when I was really sick with COVID virus and recovered. She used sarcasm and said, "Welcome back, Dr. Harper," at the beginning of a press meeting, but I didn't get to ask a question.
Well, I'm certainly glad to hear that you did recover from that. I know quite a few people who unfortunately did get COVID, and including myself. And so I'm thankful that we have a wonderful and a miraculous Creator, and who is the author of our salvation. And it's been an incredible 2 years in many ways. A lot of people hopefully would agree it's been an incredible 2 years. Maybe not the funnest, but there's been a lot of opportunities to not only share the gospel with friends and family who maybe were less receptive in the past, and so that's been a real big blessing for me. But it is good to know that you did recover from that, and it is good to know that after a year of trying and waiting, God has opened that door and has allowed you to ask some questions. Specifically, recently, you got to ask a question about Ramadan. Now, for our listeners, go ahead and explain what that is and why it's such an important thing right now within Israel.
Well, Ramadan, the Press Secretary Jennifer Psaki referred to as the holy month of Ramadan. What is really disturbing is that the Bible doesn't get attention as the Holy Bible. So I take into question about the holiness of Ramadan because it led to major violence. So my questions were couched in with the backdrop about what was going on the Temple Mount during this Ramadan, or so-called holy month of Ramadan, major violence and hurting people. There's been a lot of violence, Palestinian terrorism in Israel, and so my questions were related to the overall concern about anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism on the rise. So the press secretary is referring to this issue of Ramadan, but really didn't answer my questions about anti-Semitism. Matter of fact, she doesn't use the word anti-Semitism at all in her response. No acknowledgement that we have an anti-Semitism problem. So that was very disturbing.
And your question was a little more specific to U.S. funding of a Palestinian group. I forgot the name of it already. I'm sorry. But we fund this group. We give them kind of like almost like not Social Security, but it's kind of like a welfare kind of system for the Palestinian government and the Palestinian state. And we give them that money, and then they turn around and use it to fund their terrorism, right?
Correct. That UN agency is referred to or pronounced as UNRWA, which stands for United Nations Relief Works Agency. Initially a humanitarian agency at the beginning of Israel, when a lot of Arabs displaced from the area to provide food and shelter and so forth, but quickly became a propaganda agency. And in the textbooks, they don't acknowledge that this is Israel. They say this is Palestine. And of course, for those that don't know, actually Palestine is an invention by the Roman Emperor Hadrian. There is no Palestine. This was something that he did to insult the Jewish people and disconnect from their land. And so I've asked the President Secretary, if there is no Palestinian race of people, what's the justification for a Palestinian state? No reply yet. But this is these are so serious issues about not only about this UNRWA funding, but the Palestinian Authority that's been getting our money too, and they use our money for the Pay for Slay program. For those may not have not known about the Taylor Force Act. The Taylor Force Act is initially was passed by the Congress to defund, to leave out that part of the funding that would go to families that had their family members killed in the process of killing Jewish people. So it's a pay to slay, a reward system. And this is totally unacceptable. It would be best for the U.S. not to give any money to the Palestinian Authority or the UN whatsoever.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to note that we technically are playing both sides of that coin. We not only fund and help pay for Israel's military, we supply them with hardware. We came up with the concept of an Iron Dome. They then perfected it, and now we restock and build a lot of the components that we then sell to Israel for the Iron Dome, and we donate money to them for that purpose. And then on the flip side of the coin, we're giving money through the UN to UNRWA, but then also to the Palestinian Authority, and they're then using that money to pay families whose members kill Israelis. So we're funding both sides of that conflict then, essentially.
It's totally unacceptable. We shouldn't be supporting terrorist organizations.
Yeah, for certain.
So, yeah, this is serious about regarding truth and doing what is right, and definitely it's not. It's a waste of taxpayers to fund terrorism.
Certainly. Well, as we kind of start to wrap things up, I want to talk about two more things real quick. One of them is this week is the National Day of Prayer. That's Thursday, May 5th, coming up this week. And I wanted to take a moment and ask you, what are some of the ways we can be praying for Israel right now during this, I'm not going to use the word holy month, but Ramadan as they call it. What are ways that we can be praying for Israel right now, not only in terms of our relation, our country's relation with Israel, but their leadership? How can we be praying for them as Christians here in America?
Well, I think about it's so important to pray for the leadership of Israel to make the right decisions. Currently, there's a lot of bad leadership in Israel, and the current Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, is in that position, I believe personally, as payback vendetta, because he and the previous Prime Minister had a falling out. And what was troublesome was that this new Prime Minister accepted a anti-Semitic Arab in his coalition government to defeat Netanyahu. So it is a major red flag for him to have anything to do with anti-Semitic Arabs, and a major mistake for Israeli people to let these anti-Semitic Arabs in the Knesset. So please pray. I would say that the most important thing to pray for understanding for them, help them in matters of repentance. 2 Chronicles 7:14, the National Day of Prayer verse, is related to Israel directly, because the God of Israel is telling Solomon, this is how you do it. This is how Israel stays on track. Following this as a prescription has to be in this order. For those that don't remember the 2 Chronicles 7:14 verse, it is God's solution in dealing with a lot of problems. And that is, if my people, which are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven, forgive their sins, and heal their land. So that conditional part, ability to be humble and key component, turning from wicked ways, turning about and repenting. So pray for Israel that they will be able to do that, and our own leadership here in America as well. Both nations claim to be under God. We have great responsibility to live up to that and be in humility and in repentance. And I think, Steve, of what President Lincoln had to say in the middle of the Civil War in his proclamation on humiliation and fasting was a time that he was calling for national repentance. And so often, Steve, what is really lacking in the focus on National Day of Prayer is the repentance component, which is overall the most important thing to God, turning away from evil and honoring Him.
Well, I want to thank you for sharing that. And before we go, I do want to mention, as I said, there were two things I wanted to mention, but the primary one here is, again, National Day of Prayer is on May 5th. So definitely be looking at your communities, talk to your churches. There's going to be a lot of events, I know, all over Casper, but also all over the state for the National Day of Prayer. And if you'd like more information from Dr. Harper, again, you can reach out to him through imcnews.org. And if you're a church here in the Casper area, he's going to be coming to Casper here soon. Tell us a little bit more about that before we go, and ways that people can contact you to maybe have you come talk at their church.
Well, thank you, Steve. Be planning a trip this summer into Casper for any church that is very supportive of Israel. I'm available to speak at churches about the latest things that are going on in Israel, and especially at the White House, what is going on regarding Israel's security and so much more, to speak on human rights. So available this summer. Churches interested, they can just contact me through our website. Our phone number is 208-703-8688.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us today. I really appreciate it, and I hope that you will have more opportunities there at the White House to be called on and be able to ask some insightful and hard-hitting questions for our press secretary.
That would be great. Sure appreciate your prayers.
Mm-hmm. Thank you again for joining us today here on Meet the Day. Join us again tomorrow as we continue to look more at National Day of Prayer events coming up here in Casper.
Jan?
Go ahead.
I have a question here about following the recent Palestinian terror attacks from the Temple Mount and previous week of attacks that have killed many Israelis and wounded more. Is the Biden administration reconsidering its support of the Palestinian Authority's two-state solution dividing Israel, or stopping the welfare payments sent to the Palestinian Authority, who use the money for their pay-to-slay reward system? And I have a follow-up question.
Okay, well, I would just note that I spoke to this last week on Wednesday, where I noted that the United States is deeply concerned by the recent violence in Jerusalem, on the Temple Mount, and across the West Bank, and we also strongly condemn the recent rocket attack on Israel. You may or may not have seen also that the President conducted a call with Prime Minister Bennett on Sunday morning. He accepted an invitation by Prime Minister Bennett to visit Israel in the coming months, no specific date yet. He took note of the ongoing efforts between Israeli and Palestinian officials to lower tensions and ensure a peaceful conclusion to the holy season of Ramadan. And he also affirmed our unwavering support for Israel and its defense needs, and welcomed the historic $1 billion allocation to replenish Israel's Iron Dome system.
The follow-up is, in view of continued Palestinian violence against innocent civilians, is the Biden administration willing to stop payments to the anti-Semitic UN agency UNRWA and support restoring the Jewish cemetery in Vilnius, Lithuania, to its former glory?
Again, I think I don't have any changes to announce to our policy. I spoke to our condemnation of the violence just now, last week as well, and noted also our call to the Prime Minister. Go ahead.
Final question?
Yes.
What is this administration response to Israel for their role as mediator in this Russia-Ukraine crisis? And I have a follow-up question.
Okay. Well, we certainly support the efforts of a range of leaders who are hoping to play a diplomatic role here. And there are a number of leaders around the world who have also had engagements with Russians and engagements with the Ukrainians, and we just ask that they all engage closely with Ukrainians as well.
Okay. To help Europe develop energy independence from Russia, will the Biden administration drop its opposition to the EU East Med pipeline being developed by Israel, Cyprus, and Greece?
Look, I think there's going to be decisions made by European leaders about how to reduce their any level of dependence they have on Russian oil. You've seen a number of leaders this week announce their intention to ban oil imports from Russia, but I would remind you that pipelines are a means of moving oil. It's not a means of production, but I point you to the European leaders to speak to that. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, Jen.
I wanted to know, what will President Biden's response if Israel bombs Iran's nuclear reactors?
I am not going to get into that kind of hypothetical, but thank you. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Yes. Hi. I'd love to wish them a very Merry Christmas and a blessed season and a happy, healthy New Year to them and their families, and to let them know that this president has done more on religious freedom for all denominations and people of faith. He's the most pro-life president we've ever had as well. And he also has been trying to elevate the conversation about the murdering of Coptic Christians, for example, and he is somebody who got rid of the Johnson Amendment. He keeps on fighting for people of faith, including Christianity, but all faith. And he did that. You know, he's the first president to ever address the United Nations General Assembly on the matter of religious freedom. And he did that 2.5 months ago. It was a wonderful speech that I would tell everyone to go and access. It's on the White House website. It'd be easy to find.
I'm Dr. Harper with the Intermountain Christian News and Christian Newspaper Association. And in light of the president in support of pulling out of UNESCO, what would the president's response, to UNRWA defunding, which is a UN agency that has been in the schools specifically inciting kids to violence against the Jews, and our tax dollars going into that? Do you have any statement about, in light of UNESCO pulling out, about UNRWA?
No, I mean, I'm not as familiar probably as I should be with it. I would just offer that the responsible way to look at any program, and certainly when I went to DHS, and I did this in Iraq and other places I've been, when we're expending U.S. taxpayer money, we should look at every program and decide whether it is being successful. If it's not being successful, then change it so it can be successful, or sometimes you just say it's not going to work. Go ahead.
Follow up to that would be, the Prime Minister just came out today. There was a release, the government press office in Israel. The Prime Minister welcomed the withdrawal from UNESCO, and I had met with the Prime Minister of Israel in May about the UNRWA issue. He's very concerned. He made a statement in Jerusalem Post not too long ago in denouncing UNRWA, so I thought it would be...
I'd have to get more familiar, sorry.
גם בארצות הברית התקיימה אתמול שעת שאלות של עיתונאים במסגרת תדריך של דובר הבית הלבן. בין השמות שעלו שם היו גם שמותיהם של כמה חברי כנסת ישראלים. הנה.
Israel leaders in the Knesset, I'm aware of, are concerned about the misuse of U.S. tax dollars going to UN schools that are inciting kids to violence against the Jews. MK leaders Sharon Haskell, Yehuda Glick, and Dr. Eliza Levy, I met recently, had interviews with them. Their concerns are very serious, so they would want to know what President Trump, how he would respond to the misuse of these.
Well, I think I would go back to what I said to John a minute ago, which is that I think he has tremendous respect for how tax dollars are spent. But then I would mention again, I mean, we need a UN ambassador. We need a Secretary of State. There's a lot of these things that can start to happen under the direction of the new leadership that's being held up right now. And I think that every minute that we stall is a moment that the Democrats should have to answer for. Yeah.
Okay, I'm Anthony Harper, the Intermountain Christian Newspaper and the Christian Newspaper Association. And Israel leaders in the Knesset, I'm aware of, are concerned about the misuse of U.S. tax dollars going to UN schools that are inciting kids to violence against the Jews. What do you think President Trump, how would he respond to these Israel leaders? They're MK leaders Sharon Haskell, Yehuda Glick, and Dr. Eliza Levy. I met recently, had interviews with them. Their concerns are very serious, so they would want to know what President Trump, or how he would respond to the misuse of these.
Well, I think I would go back to what I said to John a minute ago, which is that I think he has tremendous respect for how tax dollars are spent. But then I would mention again, I mean, we need a UN ambassador. We need a Secretary of State. There's a lot of these things that can start to happen under the direction of the new leadership that's being held up right now.
So here we are on the Temple Mount in this vast area. If you can see through the trees, there's the dome. That's the Dome of the Rock. But you see how vast this area is. I mean, it's huge, isn't it? And they say that the temple wasn't built here by Herod and Solomon, and yet it doesn't make any sense.
There's no archaeological evidence elsewhere of such a large place, and what Herod did was on a grand scale. Down at the city of David, they have no evidence of a large place here. You know,
a lot of people would be surprised to know that the Jews can't even pray here. If they start to pray here, they'll be kicked out.
Right? Isn't it strange? You know that this is the land of Israel, and they have limited access to the temple, this holy place.
They gave it to Jordan, right? In a trade-off for peace.
1967, when they took Jerusalem, they acquiesced and they let Jordan administer the control of the Temple Mount. But to contrast with that is actually the Israeli police is here. You don't see Jordanian police here.
Right.
So this is Jerusalem. I mean, Israel has the total control of all this. If it comes to push to shove issue, that's why the Israeli police is here. They enforce if the Muslims becomes extreme and get out of control, which has happened, of course.
So it's just about keeping the status quo here.
Status quo.
Well, there's been a trade-off to try and achieve peace many times by Israel, but it never really works, does it, when they give away land? It never
doesn't work at all. So
we've got this Trump thing, possible Trump thing, and Australia saying that only West Jerusalem is the capital of Israel recently, and it's like more of the same thing. It's not going to achieve peace, is it, dividing Jerusalem?
We know that God's curse for those that divide Israel. Prophet Joel chapter 3 verse 2, God enters into judgment in the valley of Jehoshaphat, the nations that divide up his land. So any efforts of man, President Trump, whoever it is, Saudi Prince, Jared Kushner, no plan of peace will work. Right. Only Yeshua the Messiah will work here. So wide an experience here.
And so I'm just going to say again, the vast area of this Temple Mount, which goes all the way down, it takes a long time to walk all the way. It's such a huge area around. It's not just this, you know.
Right.
And people say that Solomon's Temple, Herod's Temple, could not have been built here. Yeah, it's huge. It's more than big enough.
More than big enough. You can see a model of Herod's Temple, what it looked like. It was more grandiose than Solomon's Temple. Herod wanted to one-up Solomon. The area was much larger, and but this was the site. So a lot happening here, you know.
Yeah, and just tell us, why is the Eastern Gate blocked up?
They're getting really aggressive to us.
We need to go.
Yeah.
Who's getting aggressive?
They're like, go get them right now.
Really?
Yeah. We gotta go.
What? Why is the Eastern Gate blocked up, Anthony?
Oh, the Eastern Gate is blocked off because actually the Ottoman or the Muslim control over this, they blocked that off. They added, from what I understand, fear that the Jewish Messiah would enter there, you know. So that's, you know, also there's a graveyard. There's an Arab graveyard right on the other side. So the Jewish tradition is that, you know, they would have nothing to do with dead bodies. And then somehow, foolishly, that they could prevent the Messiah from coming through that gate. It's so stupid, you think about this, that you could stop the creator of the universe from doing something, right?
This is the mentality.
It's like, you know, putting up a barricade, barricading, think this is going to block them, you know?
Joseph, they were just pretty stern with trying to get us off this place because the time is finished.
We told them that we were waiting for you guys. We pointed at you and they're like, well, go get them and tell them to go.
I think the part of the reason they're like this is because they're trying to keep that status quo.
Yeah.
You know, they don't. Yeah, they're trying to appease, and people think that Israeli police are just totally all against Muslims. Yet they try quite hard to
appease them.
To keep the rules. You know, to keep Israel, people from Israel off the Temple Mount beyond the time. We're not allowed in the.
So the Muslims can stay here as long as they want.
Oh yeah.
What we're discriminated against, right?
Yeah. It is religious fascism in a way, because I've never seen that in a synagogue. You know, I can go in a synagogue if I'm not a Jew, so why can't I go in the mosque if I'm not a Muslim?
Yes, I'm Anthony Harper, Intermountain Christian News, and also the Christian Newspaper Association. Not many of you may understand about in the election in the U.S. that the Christian vote turnout was significant in Trump's win. And the key issue for a lot of Christian voters in America has been, I wanted to share our Christian support for Israel. Many Christians in America praying for Israel and praying for you, Mr. Prime Minister, and for all the leadership here. There was a key scripture in the Old Testament that led up to this big Christian voter turnout in 2 Chronicles 7:14. Franklin Graham, Billy Graham's son, traveled to 50 states in the nation and called the church voters to prayer and repentance. And those voters in America believe the solution to terrorism is found in your Turnout, the 2 Chronicles 7:14. What would you share with the Christian voters in America that turned out in large numbers, about 80% of the evangelical vote, that put Trump in his position? And the Christian media that gave Trump this opportunity?
I appreciate deeply the support we have from Christian friends around the world. In the United States, North America, South America. That's a developing situation, interesting one. Europe, Africa. I visited 4 countries and I was astounded by the degree of empathy for what they said. They said the children of Israel, you represent the children of Israel. That tells you something. And the same thing we're finding now in Asia and in unlikely places. So we deeply appreciate the constancy of that support and the expansion of that support. I have to say at the same time that we're interested in broad support. In the United States, obviously bipartisan support has been an anchor of the tremendous support that Israel has. The most important alliance we have was and will be with the United States of America. So I thank you for that support. And you said, what is my message in fighting terror? I'll tell you what my message is.
Okay.
My message is actually from Joshua. It said, be strong and of good courage. That's how you fight this thing. The most elementary thing is strength and courage. Strength is not enough, but courage is the most important quality because it guarantees, I think the Romans said this, courage is not the only quality, but it guarantees the others. Because if you don't have courage, everything else is meaningless. You have to have great courage and determination to fight this evil, and I think that we can defeat it.
I'm Dr. Anthony Harper here with the Intermountain Christian Newspaper and the Christian Newspaper Association. Blessed to be here today at the White House with Sarah Huckabee Sanders. We'll be talking about President Trump's recent trip to Israel, and it's great to have you join me here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So if you could share with our listeners kind of a highlight, what happened on President Trump's trip to Israel there.
It was an incredible trip, I think, incredibly historic, given that he met with both the president and prime minister while we were there, but also a big part of his trip was meeting with making stops in all of the biggest religious kind of locations around the globe, starting in Saudi Arabia, then to Israel, and then on to Rome. It was, again, I think, both historical and very spiritual for a lot of people.
Okay, and I know one of his stops was at the Western Wall.
It was, and I think anybody that saw the visuals saw how moving that was, and certainly, again, very historic, given that no president has ever been to the Western Wall and participated in that setting.
Okay, I was there at the arrival at the airport. You were there, I'm assuming, as well.
I was, yes, sir.
Yeah, and the president of Israel was there.
He was, and including the majority, I think all of the cabinet from the Israeli government was there as well. A huge sign of respect, but I think even bigger than that, it was a sign of the unbreakable bond that we have between the United States and Israel, and it shows the importance that the president has placed on that relationship, continuing to develop that and continuing to show how important our relationship with him is.
You know, as you're aware, President Trump was talking about the violence issues, and he was there in Saudi Arabia as well. There was this global peace. There was a dedication. There was a building that he was at. Do you know anything about his time at the Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, again, this was a monumental moment, I think, not just for this trip, but in his presidency, to bring the leaders of so many different countries together, Muslim-dominated countries in that region. I think there were over 55 leaders from around that area that came to talk specifically about combating terrorism, combating ISIS. and actually getting a little bit of skin in the game and taking that burden on within the members of that region is a really big moment, again, not just for the trip, but I think that will be part of the legacy of the president.
A lot of people have been wondering how does it reduce this violence? I know President Trump talked about that this violence needs to stop, with this extremism. So what's his plan for this agreement working with and stopping this violence?
I think that it's multifaceted. You have to cut off the funding source, which is a big priority of the group that met in Saudi Arabia. It's putting an emphasis on looking at targeting them through digital and social platforms. And again, he's working with all members of the intelligence community from the Homeland Security Department as well as many others from our side to figure out the best ways to combat that. Those are some of the early ways that I know this group is focused on, is cutting off funding sources and looking at other ways to find them through different social media platforms.
Well, very disturbing what's happening there, and hopefully we can get peace, get more peace there. And a lot of Israeli people are concerned about this. And the president of Israel, when I was there at the airport, he was talking about, he referenced Muslims, Christians, and Jews. We have different beliefs, but yet we all worship the same God. And I know that he was trying to be political and trying to unite people. But there was a lot of emotion in that. So
yeah, I think anytime you're talking about the sanctity of life, which is basically what this is. I mean, people are literally fighting for survival, particularly in that region.
Right.
And it's hard for that not to be an emotional and moving moment. And I think that's one of the reasons that President Trump has placed such a high priority on national security and defeating ISIS, and making that probably one of the key points of his administration is fighting that.
I guess the final thing would be the embassy issue. There was a lot of talk about, when he was in Israel, about moving the embassy, and of course recently that he has signed something about kind of a delay in this. In the press meetings we're talking about that he was going to fulfill the campaign promise. What is the status for the embassy issue? Or are you able to comment on that?
As the president said in the statement, it's not a matter of if, but when. And right now he's trying to work through the peace process, and is still very much plans to do that, but wants to work through this process first before we take those steps.
Well, I sure appreciate your help.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Great to see you.
Thank you for joining us today.
We read news every day. News that's informative, but rarely encouraging. The Intermountain Christian newspaper aims to change that. They present the news you need to know, from what's going on in your community to your world, with encouraging words, motivation, and the resources you need to make positive changes in your life. What is your local government doing that you need to know about? What's happening in your community you need to be a part of? Whether it's a story from your neighborhood, a national story, or an encouraging word, you'll find biblical issues of everyday life in the Intermountain Christian newspaper. Intermountain Christian News is produced and supported by the work and donations of individuals and churches. You'll find it at churches, Christian bookstores, by subscription, and online at imcnews.org. To find out more about supporting this local resource, go online at imcnews.org or call Intermountain Christian News in Boise, Idaho at 208-703-8688. The Intermountain Christian News, a voice sharing the truth on matters dear to people's hearts.